Welcome to the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin's What is Spirituality podcast. Your host, Steve Spilde, is the Associate Director at the center. His guests talk about their evolving understanding of God, prayer, healing, and wholeness.
Joan-filla is a friend of the Franciscan Spirituality Center and also a personal friend. She has attended many events at the FSC, and she has done presentations for us on the healing of trauma. Joan is a physician at Gundersen Health System in La Crosse, and she has been on the front lines of the battle with COVID since the pandemic arrived in our community. Today, it is my honor to invite Joan to share her unique perspective on this traumatic period in all of our lives. Welcome, Joan.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to be here.
You work as a physician for Gundersen Health System. What's your medical specialty?
I am an internal medicine hospitalist, which basically translates to I take care of sick adults who require hospitalization. I describe myself as the quarterback. I'm kind of the one that organizes things and needs to call in the specialists when needed to take care of a patient's needs.
Take us back 18 months ago, prior to the pandemic's arrival. What were your thoughts about what might be coming, and when did you know that we would be affected here in La Crosse?
I have to admit that my first response and reaction was based out of naivete. And I remember having conversations with my colleagues saying, I just want to get this infection, get it over with, and be able to move on with my life and deal with other patients that had it. I quickly realized I did not want this infection. I was not caring for the first patient that we had at Gundersen. That was one of my colleagues who has gone on to become what I would refer to as our local hospitalist expert on COVID. It was with that patient, even though it was one patient, that I realized just a little bit of what the magnitude of this could be. That one patient where we really had there was really no guidance. There was nothing, we had no idea how to treat this other than to be supportive. We couldn't ask any specialists because nobody really knew a whole lot more than we did. And it felt, and I'm speaking for him and feeling what my colleague talked about was it felt very lonely, very fearful and then the family is afraid, the patient is afraid, patient and loved ones are separated. That patient changed me. It made me afraid to go down there, to go into the unit. So
that was the first patient you encountered, and then talk about when was that time-wise?
April of 2020. Okay. I don't remember the exact date. So I was hearing about it, COVID, hearing about it kind of secondhand from my colleagues. I didn't work in the unit, I don't think, until May, when I actually took care of my first COVID positive patient. At that point, we had a few hospitalists, docs, and physician assistants who had sort of gravitated there and had become, as much as we could be, the local experts, which hard to say experts, but when you don't know a lot, that's literally what you are. So I walked in as the physician leader for that team, being one of the least experienced ones, which is also interesting. So it's relying on a lot of past history, past knowledge, working with patients, and book learning, which it's been a long time since I've had to rely on book learning. It's been more based on experience and knowledge and actually taking care of people with issues. First week of encountering patients, I wish I could say was the hardest, but it wasn't. If anything, there was some professional excitement because it was new. It was different. It was challenging. In some ways, it was freeing, but it was also terrifying. During that week, I cared for the first COVID patient that I took care of that died. And he's there, delirious, dying alone, had already lost another family member to COVID. His other loved ones can't be there. And I remember a phone conversation with one of the family members who wanted to talk to him, but he was not even in a state to be able to talk to his loved ones. And the request came to me to tell him that I love him. So to be the messenger in a situation of this gravity where the family has already lost another loved one and now they're losing somebody else and they can't be there, to be able to go in the room, tell him so-and-so says, I love you. His response was he moved. That was as much as he could respond. And to be able to share that, it was a moving moment. It was a moment that made me say, as hard as this is, I want to keep doing it.
So in that regard, this disease is unique in terms of people are sick, people are dying, and yet you need to keep them isolated. And so family members were not in the room with them.
Correct.
And then also as physicians, you have to have a level of, or even any healthcare workers, nurses, therapists, whatever, you have to have a level of separation from the person that's not typical.
It's an interesting dynamic because you need to keep a level of separation while you are there as their surrogate family. And the largest burden of that fell onto the nursing staff, the registered nurses, the nursing assistants who spent the most time at the bedside. The respiratory therapist spent a lot of time at the bedside. I think it was easier as a physician to walk away because I had other people, other responsibilities. I'm not the bedside caretaker, but the nursing staff were phenomenal in being there to hold patients' hands, pass messages on from the family, coordinate and be present for the video conferences when we could get them, the phone conversations. All of the times that they heard loved ones saying their last goodbyes, they were there, they were part of it, giving hugs when they could. So it was very emotional. And how do you keep separate, but yet still do that feeling and be present? And that is a big challenge. And I think that's one of the traumas of healthcare in general is the art of keeping distance while being present and compassionate, but it was amplified with COVID.
Yeah, if I hear you correctly, you like literally delivering the messages, you were in the middle of that in a way that was much more intense than what would usually happen. Is that correct?
That is correct, because there's an intensity when you can visit your dying father, mother, brother, spouse, child, whoever. There's an intensity in being in the room with the family and a dying person or a sick person who was just slowly recovering. But you add in that separation and the loved ones who cannot be there, the yearning, sometimes the guilt because it was a family event, a gathering that led to them getting infected, the anger, the grief, and the phone calls that I made every day to family members of my COVID patients were among the most difficult and the most rewarding because it was the most raw, the most distant, and yet with a closeness. It really is hard to put into words.
Just for a sense of perspective, like a typical month for you, how many patients are you with that may die as opposed to during the peak of COVID? Was there, more death, a lot more death? How would you characterize that?
There was a lot more death. It kind of goes in waves. So I can have a month where I have no deaths on a non-COVID rotation. I can have a month where I have no deaths, and then I can have a month where there's 5 or 6. The hard part with COVID was the overall number of deaths. The last numbers I saw of our COVID hospitalizations, we had about a 10% death rate, which I have not seen an infectious illness cause that in my career. The other challenge is that death was not, this is hard to hear, but death was not always the worst option. Sometimes that was the relief because people were lingering and uncomfortable. I think in some ways was it the hardest struggle? One of the biggest struggles was that we did not have a cure. we could support people. We offered some treatments, which the treatment regimen evolved very quickly, just as we gained new information over the months. But it was so hard when someone would say, give me whatever it takes for me to get better. I'm already doing that, and I don't know if you're going to get better. And it was time, and we have to wait and see. And it's an incredible helpless feeling for both the patient and the healthcare team, because we're supportive, we're being supportive, we're providing oxygen, we're the kind of the basics, but there's not something that I can prescribe or administer that's going to say, poof, this gives you a chance of fixing this. It's what's your body going to do with it.
I hear a real level of vulnerability, both for you and for the patients. That's particularly unusual because physicians, I'm married to a physician, and so I know this firsthand. Physicians are not big fans of vulnerability. They like to be very clear about what they can do. And in modern medicine, they can do some amazing things. But I hear you saying in this particular case, wow, you were really limited in what you could do and really weren't sure what you could do. Is that fair?
That's absolutely true. And I think healthcare in general, we're fixers. We see a nail and we want to be the hammer.
Yeah.
I think if you look at different specialties, there's different varieties of that, or levels of being the hammer versus others. And I can say for myself that I have had a passion and a gift for end of life care. And so this fit along with my previous experiences and previous strengths, but it took it to a whole new level. Yeah, vulnerability is not a word that you want to hear or think about when you're in the midst of crisis, but that's exactly what it was. And I guess I've learned over my medical practice, celebrating 25 years this year, in general, and especially in the last year, the being willing to admit when I don't know, oftentimes gives my patients the most confidence in me, which seems counterintuitive, and yet it's respected, because we can fill people up with false confidence. But to acknowledge, I'm doing everything I can, and I can tell you why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I have the confidence in not doing X, Y, or Z while I'm doing A, B, and C, but I don't have anything else in the middle to offer. So it is, I guess, to go back to the question, being vulnerable enough to say, I don't know the answer, or I don't have the fix, more often than not is met by gratitude from patients and colleagues and staff. The other part of that is the challenge of give it time. I use this phrase a fair amount at work. Time is still our best diagnostic test. There is a desire, an urgency to find the problem now and fix it now. And in pursuing the answer, sometimes we do things with good intentions that may be unnecessary or harmful. And if we can wait, pause, we might get either the answer or at least clarity about what direction to go next.
I imagine that was especially difficult during the pandemic's not over, but it's not nearly as severe as it was at one time. You didn't have the equipment you needed. You didn't have the staff you needed. You didn't have as much, you didn't have as much time as you would like.
Yeah. And I think in general, we were lucky at Gundersen because we, for the most part, had protective equipment. So I'm going to say that part. That made it a difficult job easier. And I'm going to specify that for the hospital because I can't speak to the other areas within the health system. Part of the reason I think I gravitated toward COVID was that in some ways I felt safer there. I knew what I was dealing with, and I knew that I had the protective equipment that I needed. People gathered themselves to do the job. People from various departments volunteered to work in the COVID unit, which is something that I will be forever grateful for. People who didn't know each other before created this incredible team of cohesiveness, of teamwork, of I got your back. If you're in with a dying patient who needs more time, how can I help you with your other patients? And that's something that's always been there, but it was amplified during COVID.
But you're in this intense experience, and so some of the people you're working with as teammates, you haven't worked with them before.
Right. And that's, as a hospitalist, I go to so many different units and I work with so many different people that was not a new experience. But then being contained, I got to know people that I hadn't known before. I got to work with them really closely and develop more of a relationship, a different level of respect. I have respect for healthcare workers in general, but it's hard to, I said this already, it's hard to put into words the feeling that comes. It's a family. I need to look out for you. You need to look out for me, and to feel that sense of being held together. We're in this together to do a really difficult job, but a challenging job and a rewarding job.
And you were newly married at the beginning of this experience, correct?
Yes.
What were some of your challenges in your relationship at home? I mean, how did you balance home responsibilities with this intense experience at the hospital?
My husband took care of the home responsibilities. He was amazing through this. He put up with my emotional roller coaster, my stress, my anxiety, and took care of me. He was the one person I could hug. I've never taken for granted being able to hug people before, but that was one of the things that I missed. We also got a little bit stir crazy being together all the time, essentially. Honeymoon plans got delayed. They have not been rescheduled yet. And I shouldn't even say delayed, but their plans for what was going to be our honeymoon trip has not happened yet. We've managed other ways to get out. I was fortunate in that he had retired from his job when we got together so that he could be home to take care of things. And I didn't have to worry about him being on the road, traveling, being sick, getting sick. But I also had the struggle of, what am I going to bring home to him? And I think this was a bigger struggle for many of my colleagues who had more people living in their household. How protected are we? Now I can say we were well protected, but I didn't know that at the time. I wasn't as confident in the protection at the time because we kept learning more about COVID. But what would I bring home? Missing family events because I didn't want to bring anything to them. And I think of my colleagues who have a partner or a spouse who's working, who has children. And are they going to school? Do they need to figure out how to homeschool them? How do they balance all of that? So in a lot of ways, my life was so much simpler, even though it was complicated. The biggest thing is I'm very glad that I met my husband when I did, because if I didn't have somebody to hug when I came home from work, I think I'd be in much worse shape right now.
That's one of the things that thankfully we had what we needed as well. But, I'm thinking of a nurse who may be a single mother with kids, trying to balance that, or somebody who maybe was caretaking for an elderly parent. I mean, some people, it's pretty hard to hold it together on a good day, and these were not good days. So where did you witness that at work with coworkers?
I can't think of any examples right now, only because there's a bit of a fog over the whole thing. I guess I'm not thinking of a specific example other than the things that I've already talked about. It's the fear of, what am I going to bring home? There was the planning for staying in college dorm housing. Turbo had opened up some of their dorms to healthcare workers to stay there while they were working, or if they needed to quarantine because of an exposure, so then they're not going home. They're having to be quarantined from their own children. And some of that was also patients. I can think of one of my patients whose daughter was also COVID positive, although didn't require hospitalization. That daughter is the mother of other children how to try to stay separate from the children so they don't get it. And then when my patient grandma comes home, how to help take care of her, keep her in a separate room while you're also managing the family. I can't imagine how you do that. And that I guess that particular example, the added from a healthcare perspective, was that English was not her first language. So then trying to communicate about something that is already difficult in the same language, to have educational materials, to have handouts in a language that she can understand, not really being able to assess literacy of that written material. I guess that was probably the best situation that I can think of, and not so much on a healthcare worker, but on a patient and a patient family, of trying to balance all of that.
You had mentioned, kind of thinking back at the intense times, and it's hard to remember because there's a fog.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also done presentations at the Spirituality Center on healing from trauma. How much of that fog do you think is just a symptom of trauma, the trauma of this experience?
I think it absolutely is. In preparing for this talk, I was thinking about, what did I do to get through it, through the intensity? I had done a lot of work to recover from my childhood trauma. I think I was in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you pay attention to what you need to, but you don't remember all of the details. Not intentionally, but just you don't have the capability of dealing with that degree of intensity at that moment in time. So it gets kind of put back in a storage place. What I'm realizing now is some of that emotionality, some of that trauma is starting to come forward again. And I'm realizing some of the work that I need to do. But yeah, if I had really thought about the depth of the challenge, the details of what that was doing emotionally to me, I don't think I would have been able to do my job. Sort of like people who are in the midst of trauma, you do what you need to do to survive, to take one step in front of the other. And you can do a very effective job. I think I was a good leader. I think I was a good physician. I don't think that was impaired at all. I just don't think I was as good to myself in dealing with the emotions, because I didn't have the capability to have that full expanse. And I say that not with a sense of negativity or being hard on myself. I say that with a sense of, I did what I needed to do to get through. You do what you need to do, you survive, and then later on you can go back and look at it and go, what really happened? What was the depth of this? And what else do I need to deal with?
Based on your personal experience of healing, I mean, I think that is true, that one of the ways that we survive trauma is we learn to survive in the moment. We do what we have to do to survive in the moment. And then the healing takes place later. Once we have the resources and the time and the support to kind of unpack it, then we can start to look at it and do the emotional work we need to do to heal, correct?
Correct, yes.
This pandemic has been traumatic for our entire nation, our entire community. And I think we've been doing what we need to do to survive. What's your sense, based on experience, when some of the next steps are going to happen? When do we start to move out of survival mode and start to do the emotional work to heal? Is that going to happen in a month, a year, 10 years? What's your sense?
Depends on who you are. I think that's, I think a lot of it, for me personally, and for the people that I know, I think that's already starting. We're not completely out of the pandemic. I think there is still some degree of trauma that's happening. Part of it is we still don't know what's next. Yeah. We're getting a reprieve. Our numbers are down. Vaccines have had a huge impact, in my opinion, on helping us get to a place where we can start reopening society, where we can start reconnecting with friends and family, where we can start to do things again. We can start to live. And to me, that's an important step in starting the healing process. Mm-hmm. But the fact that there's still this question of variance and what does the future hold, that still holds me back a little bit. And talking with friends, that still holds others back yet. Part of the trauma of the initial part of the COVID pandemic was the anticipatory fear. We don't know what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
In other situations, I can think about anticipatory anxiety about doing this podcast or giving a presentation or taking a test. A lot of times the anticipation is worse than the actual event.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we are still in a place of anticipation.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting a bit of a relief. So when is it going to happen? I don't know. I think it's happening. It's going to be an ongoing thing. The amount of time that it takes people to recover is so variable. And then you can get into the question of, is it ever over? And not to say that in a negative way, but I think we are all growing and evolving in perpetuity. So I don't think there can be a time limit. And I think to say, well, it's going to happen on July 6, 2021, poof, we're going to be all better, is a falsehood, is a limitation, is setting us up for more trauma.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to meet that expectation because there's always work to do.
As I hear you talk about that work, I would label that as spiritual work. I'm interested in your definition of spirituality. What does the word spirituality mean to you?
For me, it is a connection to a divinity, a connection to everything. I see it as being very different than religion. I see religion as being part of what has harmed me in the future, but I feel like spirituality has been part of my healing. It's really hard to put a definition in. Even as I'm sitting in this room talking to you, I'm looking at the things around me that have meaning, and they range in various recognized traditions, spiritual traditions. So I have a mishmash of things. Nature is a big place of healing and spirituality to me. Animals. I have my dog sitting in the room with me right now. Being out in nature is, to me, is a connection to something that's way beyond me, that I'm a part of. I think that's an important part of it for me, is that I am a part of it. I'm not separate from it, but I'm also held in it.
What are the spiritual tools that help you connect with that larger reality?
The things that I've already mentioned, like my animals, petting my dog can be so therapeutic. The cat laying on me and kneading me, sitting out on the deck, listening to the birds, going out for a hike. I remember going out for a hike when it was 30 below this winter. That was my way of getting out and releasing a lot of that tension that built up from being in the COVID unit. There's a peacefulness out there. There's the connectedness, whether it's the sky, the snow, the dormant grass, the green rustling leaves, the animals, the hills. To me, nature is a big part of it. On a more mechanical way, I guess, meditation is a big part of it. And one of the tools that I use in meditation is my singing bowl collection. I think back to a program at FSC 9 years ago or so. The retreat, there was a meditation that included a singing bowl, and I had just a profound experience of sense of connectedness. And at the end of that, I said, I need one of those. I now have about 40 of them. But that's one of the things. A lot of times it's more, I will just take one bowl down and hold it on my heart and play it. Other times when I'm more ambitious, I'll get the set out and play the collection of them. But I also have to say that in the midst of COVID and the hardest parts, I didn't rely on them as much. And there's part of me that makes me sad, but now I also realize that was survival mode. I didn't always use all of the tools at my disposal, but they're still there for me to pick up at any time.
If you have any questions about any of the programs that they offer at the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin, we invite you to call us at 608-791-5295. That's 608-791-5295. You can also visit our website at www.fscenter.org. www.fscenter.org. Thank you for listening.